Hi, welcome to the North Star Podcast. This is Nick Erickson, and in this episode, we begin by discussing the foundations of Cartesian philosophy, the basis for what we call the quantitative mode of thinking about meaning. One might also know this way of thinking by other names, such as scientific rationalism. In thinking of the world and its meaning in this way, we fall into the trap of boiling things down to inputs, outputs, averages and statistical units, and thus miss out on the best parts of the human experience. We explore what gets left on the table with the quantitative mode of understanding meaning, and pivot to discuss the mode of qualitative meaning and what it offers, a world abundant with symbols and interpretations. But we are far from selling you on the idea of living purely in the qualitative mode of meaning, and are careful, as we often like to say on this show, to point out the pitfalls of living purely in the realm of the qualitative, and point out the advantages of living in the quantitative. Our discussion concludes with the idea that the qualitative is the mode of the sacred, that is to say, the creation and interpretation of meaning as being inherent to the human experience, and the world of the quantitative as the profane, which is to say that is not bad or sinful by nature, but rather mundane or everyday. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
So here we are. We're going to talk about some core concepts in what we think is important to communicate through this podcast.
All right, so let's back up a sec. What are we talking about in this podcast? We are heathens. We're talking about religion, as heathens should talk about religion, right?
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to enter into some discussion of some important religious concepts and what they mean to us.
Right. And
all right.
Coming at them not only from kind of a scholarly point of view, but from the point of view of people living in the modern world as it currently is, and how do we get to these concepts?
All right.
So I wanted to talk today about the distinction between the sacred and the profane, but first we need to define some terms there. And maybe we can't do that to start with. Maybe we spend the entire time defining terms, and only at the end do we come to understand what that distinction is. So we had discussed before we started recording a little bit about what the typical modern worldview is, and how that relates to kind of a very different sort of worldview that is more useful to us as heathens. One of the first things that we hit upon was that there's something missing from kind of the modern general Western worldview. And we were trying to figure out, well, what is that? What is missing?
And I think let's back off a sec. I think we should be careful, right? I think what we're talking about is often more what people are doing unthinkingly than how they're actually acting, right? I think that once we discuss this distinction, we'll find most people actually live in such a way where they are living with this distinction, even if what they're making the distinction about is maybe not what they should be. I think for most people, most of the sort of traditional worldview that sees, well, this fundamental split between the sacred and the profane, and then all the things that follow from it as central. I think most people are actually kind of living in accordance with that, even if they're sort of educated away from it. And if you ask them what they're doing, they wouldn't admit it, right?
Yes.
I think that it's such a fundamental part of human existence that it's always there, even when we're denying it.
Yeah. And I think that that's that's kind of a core thought of what's to come later. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but I think the fact that this is something central to what it means to be human needs to be out there.
Right.
Maybe hold that for later. Hold that thought.
Yeah.
I think that one of the first points to be made in thinking our way towards a better understanding of not just a heathen way of understanding the way we live life, but a human way of understanding how we live life has to do with the importance of making distinctions, right?
Mm-hmm.
It had come up in our conversation earlier. We were talking about Descartes and how everything gets reduced to two factors, which Descartes called the res cogitans, or the thinking thing, and the res extensa, or the extended thing. So
Also, we could think of them as like minds and bodies, right?
your minds and matter.
Another, yeah. Body, not in the human body sense, but in the thing that exists in space sense, right?
Sure. So also that there isn't necessarily a connection between these things. That's something that comes up in some other philosophers as well. So the modern sort of materialist worldview tends to reduce everything to the res extensa, to matter, to bodies. And that this kind of takes something out of our understanding of life.
So we take the sort of maybe messiness of our personal experience of existence, where we see that there are bodies and there are things that don't seem to quite be bodies, but they seem to sort of exist on top of each other and within each other and whatever, right? And then we sort of chop them up so that now we've got just bodies on one side and just minds on the other. And despite Descartes' attempt to make them like come together at the pineal gland, they actually really don't. And there you are, right? You got this problem that you've got the two things. And it turns out that most of what you need to explain, you can explain without this separate mind type thing that doesn't take up space and is simple and indivisible and all this other stuff. And so you, being a good rational human being, think, well, why am I wasting time with that? There are only bodies, there is only matter, and you're done. And it seems that you have denied a certain portion of human experience. And the way people continue to talk about things is that way still, right? People still talk about minds as if there's something different from bodies, even if when you ask them, oh, no, it's just the brain, which leads you to believe that something else is going on here, right? This is, I think, a theme we might return to a lot here is that people often act and speak about their experiences in a way that's contrary to what they would say their experience is if you ask them. So they have sort of an educated view of what they're doing in life, and then they have what they're actually thinking that they're just not stating, which is often much more traditional than their educated view, and yet it holds on.
That leads me to a question. I've heard some people say that the goal of materialism and reducing everything to bodies or matter, and also to kind of non-differentiated ideas of space and time, is to achieve a kind of objectivity, which can be defined or has been defined by some people as kind of the view from nowhere. And that the basis of that idea is actually to understand from kind of a Christian or Judeo-Christian or Abrahamic point of view what the perspective of God is, so that the entire thing does ultimately have kind of a religious ideological basis, even if that's not something that's explicitly stated. What are your ideas on that?
the attempt to come to a non-perspectival view, I think that pre-exists Judeo-Christian ideas, at least Christian ideas, by a long time. I think you see that in Plato, right? The idea that the only things that can be real are things that are not affected by time or place, right? The forms, as they're called. And that's the only source of true knowledge, seems to be an attempt at some kind of a God's eye view, a view outside of time, and an unconditioned view, let's call it that. I don't think you have to be part of an Abrahamic or a monotheistic religion to valorize that kind of unconditioned view.
Okay.
I do think, though, that you have to be careful, because whenever you come up with that kind of an unconditioned view, you're coming up with an abstraction from reality. You can't actually be at that perspective looking at the world. Yeah. At least, there might be some kind of a altered mental state that gets you something close to that. But certainly if you're just trying to do it through thought and experimentation, you're not getting there. And claiming that you are is problematic, right? And it takes away a lot of the nuances of human experience of things.
Sure.
It has its uses. It certainly does work for science, and science is pretty cool. I may be a Luddite, but I am not against science. I'm just against it being used in the wrong places or for the wrong reasons, right? I certainly think that we've learned a lot of great stuff thanks to science, and it's the best method because it is a method of getting to certain kinds of truths. It's a problem when we try to make it get at other kinds of things.
Sure.
One of the things I was going to ask you guys is what was kind of the driving motivation behind like a Descartes philosophy? Is it to reduce and kind of minimize reality to understand it better? And, qualitatively, what's some of the stuff that gets left on the table or not addressed in this worldview?
I would say I'm a little hesitant to talk about like a driving motivation for a guy like Descartes, right? Descartes arose at a time when there was sort of a, scholasticism, which started with, I suppose, Aquinas's appropriation of Aristotle for Catholicism, had been the guiding force of Western ideas of knowledge for a long time, and had pretty much run out of steam. And so if there was any kind of a motivation, and I think that he stated this himself, Descartes' motivation was to get away from this scholastic Aristotelianism because it wasn't going anywhere. Mm-hmm. So I don't necessarily want to talk about motivations, but I do think that we can look at Descartes and say, where did it go, right?
Right.
You don't find a lot of dualists in the world anymore, at least not, sort of in academia or wherever it is that we turn for the official view of truth, right? Whatever that is. I think there are a lot of dualists sort of in normal life. A lot of people think their soul is an immortal, undamageable, simple thing that is non-material and whatever. And they're probably dualists in a sense, although whether they would think of it that way or not, they may also be the people who think that the soul has a little bit of weight that leaves your body when you die, in which case they're not exactly proper dualists. But I think that what we need to see with Descartes is not, and I'm no Descartes expert, as I'm sure any Descartes expert listening to this is saying to themselves often and loudly as they listen. I'm no Descartes expert, but I know enough to say that he does stand as sort of a signpost on the way through how Western views of knowledge have evolved. He gave us a certain kind of clearly defined dualism that doesn't seem to stand up for most of us for various reasons. And I think the main reason that it ended up not being as useful as one might have hoped is scientific. That almost everything you want to explain scientifically, you can explain without reference to this non-material mind substance. Therefore, you don't use it. Therefore, you get this universe that's made up just of body, of res extensa, of the extended stuff, the stuff that takes up space, that when it interacts with other things, interacts essentially mechanically, and therefore you get a mechanical and some would say dead universe, at least conceptually. Yeah, so that I don't know that that's talking about his motivation, but that is talking about the result, right? Where it goes.
Yeah, how do we get here from there?
And that's a part of it. And you know, the main problems to begin with were problems about interaction. If body just works mechanically, which seems to be what he was saying, and minds don't take up space, how can something that doesn't take up space have weight or do any of the other mechanical things that we expect mechanical things to do, make bodies move? Well, he had this idea, and I wasn't kidding about that it was because they interacted at the pineal gland in some mysterious way, which really doesn't work. And therefore, people came up with all kinds of weird ideas about like sort of a non-interactive parallel existence between the two and stuff like this. That's Leibniz. It's weird stuff. But ultimately, it just seemed to be more useful to most people to walk away from Cartesian dualism.
Seems like it almost turns the human into like a lizard-like being, like where there's just inputs. Like you have this input and then the body will respond this way, which is certainly, I don't think, describes human motivation and human psychology.
I think the response to that would be that, I mean, yes, that our brain is basically kind of a machine for responding to stimuli or for responding to inputs. The human brain is extraordinarily complex, therefore we can't see it as obviously as we see it with like bugs and lizards and whatever, where we can pretty clearly know how they're going to react given certain stimuli, right? My sense of this not being correct has less to do with observing others and more to do with observing myself, right? Because from inside of this machine, I don't feel very machine-like.
Right.
Most of the time. I have my moments, but...
Right. And there's certainly a mode of existence that's mechanical, like as you go through like a morning routine and you're groggy, there's like a certain type of just muscle memory that goes through. But yeah, as far as like reasons why, like the why we do things is certainly multifaceted and not easily reduced into a single input-output type of schema.
Yeah, I think that's correct. But again, I think that people who do believe that it is reducible that way have, you know, pretty good responses to people like us saying, it doesn't feel that way. And I'm not going to try to knock those down because we probably don't have the time and that's probably not what we're here for. But I think we should, you know, not underestimate the strength of those kinds of arguments.
Sure.
Yeah.
But when it comes down to it, the sort of understanding that we're driving at is one that feels more, or one that the human beings feel more at home in, right?
Yeah.
The way that humans, you talked about it yourself, how people act as opposed to what they say their motivations are. That sort of thing is far closer to what we're aiming at as heathens in how we approach the world. It's just that rather than acting in one way and justifying our actions or explaining our actions and motivations in another, we're looking at explaining how we actually perceive things. Right.
Yeah. I want to be careful. I didn't become a heathen thinking, you know, now I want to understand how it is that I really think about the world or something like that, right? It was a very much less rational thing. I had some idea that religion was a good thing. I didn't like the religion I was a part of, and Germanic gods were pretty fucking neat, right?
Yeah.
That's really where it started, and it just held on from there. And that sounds pretty lame, but conversion often starts from certain motivations, and yet we can try to explain what's so great about our religion or our view of various religions or whatever. And it's often very different from why we actually got into them.
That's a fair point.
Oh.
I think that our motivations for starting out in this religion might be one thing, but we've all been part of this for a good long time now.
Yeah.
And I think that something that I've noticed for myself is how if you follow through with your initial motivation sincerely and assiduously, it will transform how you view everything.
Right. So there's
including the human.
When we start, most of us on this, there's, like I said, I mean, my reason was basically some combination of aesthetics and I don't know, pride in my ancestry or something. And it brought me to a place where I've discovered tremendous depth, tremendous intellectual depth, tremendous spiritual depth, for want of a better word, but also this tremendous intellectual depth that I don't know that I was expecting that to begin with, right?
No.
And indeed, there are a lot of people who get involved in this who think that it's all very primitive and they love the primitive, and they think that they can worship gods by drinking too much and yelling a lot and hey, and good for them, I guess. But something else happened with me, and I think with you guys.
Yeah.
So now back to where we were at, though. We are wandering far afield, as we often do.
I think I have an interesting pivot point. A couple of ideas have been floating around, kind of grouped all in the same: art and aesthetics.
Yeah.
And then also something you mentioned about a philosophy that we can feel more at home at. So a couple of ideas using Descartes, the idea of art and why you'd design a certain piece that way or a song lyric in a certain way. It often can be like a multiplicity rather than, I'm going for this one thing. It's like a kind of that input-output mode. And it's kind of speaking to where I think we want to go, which is qualitative versus quantitative. Like each person can interpret a song a multiple different ways versus this is the one meaning, this is what I put into it, and this is what you're going to get out of it.
Well, if I can come in here, I think you're pivoting really well here. So I wanted to say, how did we get to Descartes? We got to Descartes because we were going to talk about this distinction between quality and quantity.
Yes.
And of course, we started talking about Descartes, but we didn't get to what he has to say about quality and quantity, which is this, right? In Descartes' world, space and time are basically just numbers, right? Space is a Cartesian coordinate system, an X, Y, and Z axis, and any particular point in space differs from any other only by which numbers you assign it in relation to an arbitrarily chosen 0 point. And that's it. Space, one point in space is the same as any other. It might have something else in it, but the space itself is different. Time for Descartes, it's a line with a bunch of numbers on it, right? Or a bunch of hash marks or something. And that goes with with half of his dualism, right? The material half of his dualism. It's all just kind of, it's stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Our experience as humans, though, is that neither space nor time is undifferentiated like that.
Right.
Home is not the same as the marketplace or the street or the dump.
Mile marker 195 on the highway.
Right. It's not the same as any of those. Home, in fact, has a particular quality, a quality that, even if it's not a great house or a great home, the fact that you've lived in it for a while and that it's set up in a way that you feel comfortable in it, making it a home, makes it a space completely different for you from all others, right? Time, or different times mean different things. Yule is not Easter. Neither Easter nor Yule are some random work day in August, right? the way it's not just that certain things happen during these times. There's an entire different quality to the time, a different feeling to the time. You couldn't move Yule stuff to Easter, at least not and have it be successful, right? It would suck. And you don't want to make Yule suck. Yule's great. You don't want to make Easter suck either. Easter's great too. Quality is the thing here, not quantity. Not that these don't have some relation to each other, but even when we look at the way that people used to think, numbers had specific meanings, right?
Yeah.
We don't have this well recorded among our ancestors. A lot of things like 3 and 9 seem to have been important in ways that don't just have to do with them being, 3 is not just between 2 and 4. It's its own thing.
Sure. And I was just reading this morning about like Pythagorean associations between like the number 6 and Aphrodite and the number 7 and Artemis or Athena rather. Yeah. The qualitative side of quantity, far aside from anything that Stalin might have ever said. That's an important part of it that gets us deeper into kind of a general overall qualitative experience of life.
Right.
And one of the things that, what is this qualitative experience of life? We had been talking before about it being a sense that there is meaning to existence, which we might not define, but paraphrase as being significance to existence, right? What does that mean? And one of the things that we'd come to is almost a different dimension, a sense of the depth of things behind existence, the sort of Cartesian materialist view of the world without distinction is one in which, the world might appear to one as kind of an undifferentiated plane.
Right.
We're talking about this sort of Cartesian worldview that underlies what we might call the materialist worldview, and how it
maybe better the profane worldview. Let's just go there.
Sure. The profane worldview, without qualitative distinctions, presents itself as kind of an undifferentiated plane. Now, when I think about that, I think about like all of those like early like 1980s to 90s sort of computer graphics where you literally have a grid and you're like driving in some kind of a car towards a horizon that never gets any closer. And sometimes there's mountains or a city in the horizon, but you're never getting any closer to that because there's no connection between that and where you are. So when I'm imagining a Cartesian grid, I've got like 80s synth music going.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've got the synth music going in my head right now. Yeah.
Yes. So we don't want to be there.
Maybe only on occasion.
Right?
Take the synth music with, too.
Yeah.
You can bring that into the sacred Orville.
But I think that is a good image for us to look at when we're trying to figure out, okay, what is it we're about? What is it we're not about? And think of that plane, think of that grid. There's nothing to distinguish, 1 mile from the next. It's all the same. And what you're talking about in talking about the qualitative distinctions between different spaces and different times is that nope, there is actually distinction to be made. What is that distinction? And in the past, going off of some of the influences that I have from, say, Eliade, I've talked about it in terms of meaning, right? But what is meaning? You can paraphrase meaning as significance, but that doesn't really define it, right? Mm-hmm. It's just the idea that there's something, meaningful or significant about certain times and places. Saying that there's a qualitative difference is saying the same thing again. It's a paraphrase. It's not a definition. So what is the definition that we're talking about? Or what defines this meaning or significance or qualitative difference?
Well, and that's tough, right? The depth I'm thinking of, when I think of sort of what I take to be meaningful religious conceptions of the world. When I think of qualitative views, let's say, of existence, I have an idea that there are a lot of homes. We were talking about home just a second ago and how it qualitatively differs from just a place, your cell number 3796 that you can sleep in before going to work is not home necessarily, unless you make it home somehow. But when you look at early perspective paintings where they had the single point perspective for the first time, and they would paint these sort of, like architectural pictures, and there's like columns that keep decreasing in size to a single point. You got to look around at the places you're not supposed to look at for the perspective. Because you find, over here on the left, there's a couple doing things they shouldn't be doing in public. And over here on the right, there's a guy with a knife about ready to rob someone. And all these spaces that are kind of empty and that are sort of irrelevant to the point perspective, not all of them, but some of them are filled in a way that it gives these early paintings a kind of weird depth.
Yeah.
There's kind of a, it's maybe not beautiful or whatever. I don't have anything against amorous couples, but, these were Catholics, so they probably did, On a similar sort of level, so I'm just throwing stuff together here. In a similar sort of way, if you go to, let's say, a pre-20th century, and not only, but certainly a pre-20th century Catholic, let's say, I haven't been in any Eastern Orthodox buildings, so I wouldn't know, and Protestant buildings are a whole different problem. But like a cathedral or a basilica or something. I've been in a few cathedrals in Europe. I've been in the basilica in Minneapolis, right? You find, at first glance, you see that there's just crap everywhere. There's plaques and statues and just stuff. But you start paying attention, and instead what it is, if you think, as I think you should, of a properly constructed religious building as a kind of reflection of the structure of the world that the constructors of that building believed in, you start finding, at least in well-constructed ones, that all the stuff that's everywhere fits, right? It seems to be where it should be, because these are people who believed in a universe that had a lot of spaces in it that were spaces where things had homes. Spirits, angels, saints. A lot of these older churches, they buried people right inside of them. So under your feet are dead people, right? They even have a home. Why are they under your feet? I don't know, but that's where their home is. So there's this sense of sort of an inhabited universe, an inhabited world. Yeah. And where things have their habitation matters. It's not just about finding a space and shoving them in it. It's about them being in the space that's the right space for them. And I think that gets at the idea of significance in the way that we are experiencing things. When we experience things that we take to be religiously or spiritually significant, it is because certain things happen in the right space at the right time for us to feel that significance.
Yeah.
Now, probably also a part of this is that we see correspondences between different things that don't necessarily correspond to sort of normal connections, ravens mean death. Okay, well, I've known a lot of dead people. Very few of them have been killed by ravens, but that connection is there, right? And of course, that goes back to a long time ago when ravens would eat dead people on battlefields. Now, not most recently, but fairly recently, I was in Yellowstone, and we were parked at a parking lot, and ravens were wandering around eating bugs off of the grills of cars. And I felt that this was a very sad sign for the condition of ravens in our age, but just kind of really unfortunate.
The menu has suffered.
How the mighty have fallen.
Right.
But whatever. There are things that appear in the place where they're supposed to appear. or where they're appearing tells us something about how the world is about ready to express itself to us, how the world is about ready to be for us, right?
Yeah.
The raven is telling us, if it's, sort of a real sign and not just, hey, I happen to be here where there's a bunch of ravens. The raven is telling us something that, look out, or death is near, or, whether it's our death or the dead or something, it's near, right? And unfortunately, the ones in Yellowstone were apparently telling me dead bugs were near, which, like I say, it's we live in a fallen world.
Another point that from the What is Religion episode, just adding on to meaning, the Eliade definition, kind of goes along with the correspondence thing, mentation, and just like the thought process when you encounter a raven and all of the different context clues that you kind of put together and think through as you're meaning making in the world.
And I guess I would caution, I'm going to pull a Garrett here and say we need to be careful. Is it that you're making meaning in the world, or the way that I tend to perceive it, and this has taken some discipline, right? Because I used to think of meaning as specifically that thing that human minds did. I'm not so sure anymore. Mm-hmm. I think that it's a matter of perceiving meaning that's there.
Yeah.
And that kind of comes down to that's kind of one of the central points here, is that meaning isn't something that human minds put into existence. And going back to Descartes, now that we've thoroughly explored the sort of worldview that Descartes put there, maybe it's time to start cycling backwards.
Let's be careful, because I'm all about that. We have thoroughly explored what is probably a caricature of the sort of worldview that Descartes put out there.
Fair enough.
And the way it's come forward.
Fair enough.
And I think that, in a way, we should think about that in terms of those paintings that I was mentioning, with all the bad stuff happening off in the parts you're not looking at.
Sure.
You can think of the single point perspective, architecture thing as the edifice built by whoever's building it, Descartes, his successors, whatever. And yet, nobody just sees that, right?
Right.
There's always all this other stuff still going on.
Right.
And there is, for even the most, straight out of the box, materialist, whatever, physicalist, there is nothing but that. There's still weirdness going on in the world.
Right.
And they might devalue it. They might
ignore it.
They might try to reduce it to something else, but it's still there. It's always there, and you can't get away from it.
Yeah. So maybe it's a good place to talk about whether whether the distinction between kind of the internality of the mind and the externality of the experienced world is useful. Maybe it's not.
I think it's got to have some use, but I think we have to be careful with it becoming overstated, right? The mind is certainly not separate from the world. And I think that the converse is also true. Humans don't exist without the world. And I think that's a conceit of a lot of philosophers, spiritualistic movements, all kinds of other things. There is somewhere in the world this completely self-sufficient thing that is the human self.
Mm-hmm.
And its relationship to the world is merely some kind of accident. It's not essential to who or what it is.
Yeah.
And yet I think who we are, where we come from, where we've been, where we are, what we do, all these things. Well, yes, I think there's probably some kind of core thing in the middle of us somewhere that's pretty distant from all that, but all of that is a part of who we are. And what our mind is doing is not some self-sufficient separate thing that just happens to kind of be, watching the world the way that, like, I was watching TV while I was cleaning my living room the other day.
Mm-hmm.
It's fundamentally something that exists not through interacting with the world, but as a part of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting. Something that's been kind of going around in my mind. I used the term meaning making on kind of on accident, but I think it's an interesting kind of nugget. The idea of, do we construct it with the available pieces as we perceive, or what do you guys think about that? Like, because it seems like there's an element of construction, or even just kind of adapting it to as time moves on.
I think there's interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
There's definitely interpretation, but again, the more I sink into a heathen worldview, the more I'm really unsure about what part I play in that.
Mm-hmm.
The more it seems to me that there's stuff going on, and whether or not I notice it is on me, but it's going to go on one way or the other. So again, we're faced with kind of a fraught question of, what do we mean by meaning?
Mm-hmm.
Is meaning the interpretation, or is meaning something already there that we just happen to perceive and notice, right? I'm not sure how to answer that question.
Well, and maybe neither of those options is good. Maybe meaning is what comes from the interaction between whatever is out there and our ability to interpret it. Without us, no meaning. Without the universe, no meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Or the non-human universe, whatever. Right? Given that I just emphasized that we're part of the world, I should probably not pretend like we're separate from the world.
So then, okay, that raises an interesting avenue of thought. Is it that the human is required to perceive meaning that is there in a sense, or there in potential in a sense, but that it occurs explicitly at that point, that we are the part of the universe that experiences meaning,
or a part of the universe that experiences meaning?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to. Yeah,
it certainly seems like there's a selection process too.
Yeah.
Like for the raven, you can pick out certain elements, like the death aspect of a raven, or I've seen a recycling aspect be kind of raised. So it's
sure.
Yeah, and those are context clues. Those will be influenced by context clues.
And ravens will mean, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but ravens are going to mean different things to different people, and so maybe the specificity of who is there and their own background and their own understanding is significant.
Mm-hmm.
So let's think of an example of a thing that meant something to us. A few years ago, we did a ritual, let's call it, for Fosita. And afterwards, just out of nowhere, a hawk came flying over. Remember this?
Yes.
In your backyard.
Yeah.
Now, hawks fly over backyards all the time. I don't know how often hawks fly over your backyard, but this one we happened to notice in the context of having just done this ritual. And indeed, I think that it's a relatively rare thing for that hawk to be in your backyard. I mean, you don't go out there and have to fight off hawks all the time, right?
Not usually, no.
Your dog wasn't out there barking at them all the time or anything. Yep. So a relatively rare, but not impossible or super strange occurrence. It wasn't the sun stopping in the sky or anything. It was just an animal happening to be there. Now, we all noticed it, I think, immediately.
Yeah.
But it took a little bit for us to remember that in one of the lists of Skaldic kennings, I can't remember where it is. It's not in Skald's Kaparmal. It's
Hatatal?
It might be Hatatal. I honestly don't remember, but it's somewhere in
Prozetta. Somewhere in the Prozetta.
Or I'm not even sure it's actually in the Prozetta. I think it might be in a separate list of kennings.
Okay.
But in any case, that there is recorded in Old Norse texts that there's what is it like? Is it just that Forseti is called hawk or something? That Forseti is a kenning for hawk.
Yes.
Which, that's fascinating. So we just did a rite for this god, and just for the heck of it, the bird that his name is a kenning for reasons that are lost in the mists of time, unfortunately, happens to show up. Now, one interpretation of this is, birds show up over your yard sometimes, and you guys saw a bird, oh, wow, hey, it's that. But it certainly felt like something more. given the rarity of that occurrence, the rarity of our noticing that occurrence, the fact that this thing had just happened, we were doing it. Now, admittedly, we aren't all hanging out in Ritter's backyard all the time. Ritter, I suspect, spends a fair amount of time back there, it being his yard and all, but most of us are not usually there. But nonetheless, when he's out there, he hasn't seen a lot of hawks, right?
True.
Yeah. And there it was, at the right time, the right place, and we put a particular interpretation on it, that this was a sign that we'd done the right thing for this God.
Yes.
Now, like I say, there are plenty of ways to dismiss or reduce this, but certainly our feeling was that this wasn't just our minds coming up with something because there was something cool out there, but was that this is a message.
Yeah.
And I find that interpretation of the event is the most useful for me. Now, maybe someday I'll discover somehow that I was just dead wrong. It wasn't a message. I don't know how the hell that would be. I don't know. It's unfortunately, it's not really a very falsifiable idea, right? We know that for some definitions of science, for things to be true, they have to be falsifiable and not falsified, right?
Right.
Well, I don't know how you'd falsify this one. So it lingers in an area of knowledge or belief that's, well, certainly not scientific or whatever. And yet it has a certain important validity to us.
And I think that touches on kind of the limitations that you alluded to before about the scientific worldview. Like you said, science as a method for arriving at certain kinds of truth is great, but there are certain kinds of truth that it can't arrive at. What we might call meaning or significance is one of these.
Right. I think that's absolutely correct. When you get to, I think that with science, you lose meaning of the sort that we're talking about. And I think the sort of meaning that we're talking about is a fundamental part of human existence. So if you reduce all of your sense of truth to scientific truth, then you lose something important.
Yeah.
Now, there are spaces where you need scientific truth. And if you're just hoping for, I don't know, omens and portents as opposed to, reproducible experimentation on whether a particular drug works, you're probably going to make a mistake. You shouldn't do that, right? But, and by probably, I mean definitely. I'm just going to put that out there. Definitely, right? Don't test drugs with omens and portents. Test drugs with science. But this other area of belief is, as I say, fundamental to human existence. And I don't think you can get away from it, and I think you need it. And I certainly know that my life is enriched when it shows up, when I sense a certain kind of meaning in certain occurrences, like that hawk coming down after that ritual. My life is deepened by it. And I like having a deeper life. Depth is good.
One of the things I think I can imagine the listener wondering is how can we draw the line between significance or insignificance in religious life?
And that one's tough. I agree. I know the people who every time that anything happens in their vicinity, they take it as a message from a god or a spirit.
It's very easy trap to fall into, especially early on.
Yep. And it turns into almost a kind of, neurosis or something.
Yeah.
And I certainly know, I know a number of people where that happens, and they are nearly insufferable to be around.
It's that whole if everything means everything, then everything means nothing.
I think that a good way to avoid that kind of a stumbling block is simple humility. None of us are likely to be so important that gods or spirits or the universe are sending us messages all the freaking time. The shape of the soap bubbles when you're washing dishes probably is not trying to tell you some deep message, right?
Really?
Sorry, Gerd.
Shoot. Made many decisions based on that.
Right. I mean, the traditional tried and true soap bubble omen. And I'm not trying to diminish that kind of experience. But it's important to develop a certain degree of discernment. Discernment is hugely important in this sort of thing, especially when you don't have an objective sort of rationale to make these sorts of decisions for you. And I think that there are people who fall into that sort of trap because they want to feel like they are at the center of kind of communications with, you know, the gods in the world, etc. And I'm not going to discount that people get those sorts of communications. Obviously, you know, the hawk that we were talking about, and we've had other experiences, a large number of them avian experiences that seem to point to some sort of deeper meaning or to the correctness of things that were going on. They seem to be communications of a sort. But there is, at the same time, what we talked about before, there is pareidolia.
Yeah.
There is a tendency for the human mind to see patterns in things, particularly when it is explicitly looking for patterns in things. If an individual wants there to be, or has the desire for this sort of constant communication with spirits or gods, and then they start to project this sort of pattern seeking onto the world. There's a difference there. There's an important difference between I'm seeing patterns because I want to see patterns, and I see a pattern that I didn't expect.
Yeah.
And it's important for any person, you know, heathen, pagan, Christian, atheist, whatever, to understand that themselves well enough to know whether they're projecting the will to pattern onto the existence that they perceive, or whether they're doing something else, which is being open to it without actively seeking it. That openness is something that I think that we should discuss in a later episode, maybe. But that's vitally important and not always easy to cultivate.
Well, there's sort of a, you know, there are extremes. There are the people who every trivial thing in their life is determined by some portent or omen or something, right? The gods told me I should braid my hair today. Yeah, I don't think they did, right?
Right.
And then there are the people who there's just nothing. Some Greek playwright had written something that was like sort of insulting to Zeus. And he was walking by the sea and an eagle dropped a turtle on his head and he died. Now, this was an area where eagles dropped turtles on people's heads. Well, not on people's heads, but on rocks to break them open. And I guess his head maybe looked like a rock from the air. Maybe not. I don't know. That seems portentous anyway, right? There's a context there that says, you know, people rarely get killed by turtles falling out of the sky, and you did this. And, yeah. But, you know, one might argue that's just whatever. It's an arguable one. But it does seem that there's a weird middle area, right, where it's often not certain. Is this really some kind of portent? Am I reading too much into it? This especially happens. You know, you have dreams. Sometimes you have creepy-ass dreams. These creepy-ass dreams, some warning from the gods, some, or am I just, did I just, you know, have a little too much sausage before I went to bed, right? You know, what's going on here? And I think that often you have to be open, not just to one option, but to both, right? You have to be open to this actually being a portent. You have to be open to it being just, you know, dyspepsia. It's,
I think also scale too. Seeing it as a spectrum, like maybe this is lower M meaning, like meaningful to me, rather than this is like a very damning sign. I think, and also context too. I think if you find yourself getting a sign in a more profane context, like the dish soap divination, then that's maybe like ignore that one too.
Well, you know, it is traditional to divine from fairly profane things, right? Tea leaves, whatever. I mean, I've never done that, but I understand people do. And I don't know, maybe there's something to it.
Maybe we just haven't like sufficiently tried to chart out the meanings inherent in dish soap divination. You know, it's always a possibility. But I mean, neither is this a new problem, right?
Right.
This isn't something that just occurs with, you know, modern neurotics or people who are delving into the occult or alternative religions for the first time. There was a book written on this in Rome by Plutarch, I think, De Superstitione, so concerning superstition.
Was that Plutarch or Cicero?
It's Plutarch. I just looked it up. While you guys were talking, I was surreptitiously Googling.
So didn't Cicero write something about divination?
Yep.
And he basically if I'm remembering, I haven't read it. I've read like accounts of it. I seem to remember that he was pretty negative about divination.
He was somewhat negative about divination. Oh, maybe what I'm thinking about is Cicero and not Plutarch.
Yeah.
But he kind of lampoons this sort of obsessive consulter of divination.
Yep. Which is kind of what we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, again, goes to show this is not a new problem.
Yep. But we certainly don't, we certainly don't discount the value of divination in general.
No.
Right?
And as a heathen, it would be hard to, seeing as a lot of the sources that we have show that this was, you know, a very frequent part of the daily life of heathens.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
Tacitus talks about how the Germanic tribes consult their notai for all sorts of reasons.
Yep.
And other sorts of divinatory practices as well. So we have to, if we're being sincere about this whole heathen thing, we have to accord it some usefulness and meaning. So we've gone from Descartes to divination, and what I wanted to talk about was I wanted to bring this back to kind of a core distinction, qualitative distinction that's important in religion, and that's between the sacred and the profane. So what do we mean by those terms? My understanding of, well, there's a couple different ways you can define the sacred, right?
Yeah.
And the profane is always going to be defined by what is not that, right? It's going to be a negative definition.
Mm-hmm.
But what the sacred is, you could say that it has to do with the gods, but that takes you down another rabbit hole of, you know, what are the gods? What does that mean? But precisely this sort of discussion about significance, about meaning, about things being qualitatively different. One of the ways in which things can be qualitatively different is that they can be sacred and they can be set apart as something having to do with the gods or the relationship between us and the gods.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's, to some degree, it seems like maybe examples are easy. So sacred versus profane, a temple versus a parking lot.
I think one of the examples that I've used in the past is, I think we're all familiar with this one particular idol of Freyr that was found that's basically just a forked branch with a face carved on one end. And one of the forks looks like he was probably very popular with the ladies.
Yes.
And I've thought myself through the process of how did this idol come to be, especially one that's so primitive and relatively unshaped.
Yeah.
What distinguishes that branch that was carved into an idol from another branch that might have been lying 3 feet away on the forest floor? And you can take yourself through the scenario, right? When someone's walking along, they look down, they see a branch, and they think, whoa, there's a god there.
Mm-hmm.
They take the branch home, they carve the face to make the image of the god that they see in it a little clearer. What distinguishes that branch from another one that was lying close by? I think that from our point of view, it's not pareidolia. It's not just you're seeing patterns that aren't there. There's something mysterious there.
Something that comes out at you.
Yes.
So it pre-exists somehow your experience with it, but without your experience with it, it doesn't matter in a way.
Right.
No, someone's experience with it, right?
So this is going to take me a little bit far afield, but I'm reminded of a book that I read called Zen and the Art of Archery, which is about a German philosophy professor named Eugen Herrigel, who goes to Japan to study Zen, ends up picking up archery as a way of doing that, and talks about his experiences in a very straightforward way.
Mm-hmm.
And once he achieves kind of what he's looking for, he describes that experience as, you have a bow, you have an arrow, you have a target, and you have yourself, the archer. And at a certain point, your sense of self isn't concentrated in the archer. It's kind of diffused throughout. So there is this process that's happening, which is an arrow being shot by a bow by an archer towards a target, but you're not the shooter necessarily. You're kind of in there somewhere where this entire process is occurring. The shooter, obviously, the archer, is a necessary part of the process. So we could say that the person who is there to witness the god emerging from the piece of wood is a necessary part of the process.
Okay.
Not the only part,
Right.
but a necessary part. There has to be an audience. There has to be a witness.
Yeah, and yet in an important way. Well, maybe this doesn't hold very well. I was going to say that there's an anonymity in these works of art that are holy. But of course, in civilizations where we have records, we often find out who actually made them.
Yeah.
But at the same time, certainly even, why is Eddic poetry anonymous? Skaldic poetry isn't.
Right.
Right? I don't think it's just a question of it just happening to be that way. I think there's an actual reason.
Yeah.
These holy statues, we don't tend to know who made them. We know sometimes who set them up, but that's not who made them, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's my thought. There's a little inchoate, but there does seem to be a sense in which there's an anonymity to this. And I think that holds in a lot of cases. And that's because the ego of the person involved in the making isn't what's supposed to be coming through.
Right.
Now, that's not to say that we're a self-denying type religion. I don't think we are, but we're not out to exterminate our egos or something and seeking enlightenment. But certainly there is an important sense in which when something bigger than us is coming out, that's what we got to see.
Right. There's at least instances in which it's important to get that out of the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that something else can shine through as being the most important thing.
Right. Yeah. So the holy, the sacred, whatever we're talking about. Well, we're using both those words right now. We can talk about distinctions at some later time, I think. There's a lot of sacred or holy things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Spaces, buildings, events,
Objects.
Intelligences, yes. Right? Let's not say people, but intelligences, poetry, music. Not much of our ancient sacred music survives, I suppose, but we have maybe come up with some. Certainly we've come up with poetry that's holy, and there is poetry that survives. It's holy, right?
Yeah.
Just mentioned some. What these all seem to have in common, though, is this sense that there's more meaning to them than is sort of obvious. There's the Voluspa, right? Whatever you think of it. I know there are people who want to argue any number of things about it. I'm in the it's a heathen thing camp, right? And we'll stay there until I'll probably stay there. But the Voluspa, it's not just a story. It's not just a yarn told to entertain. There are depths to it. And there's almost, you keep going back to it and it keeps giving you more if you go back to it in the right frame of mind.
Yeah.
And I think it's Is it inexhaustible? I don't know. I mean, infinity is a hard thing, but it's certainly far from easily exhaustible.
It's very full. We
Yeah.
can at least say that much. And the same goes for other similar sorts of poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And we have books of it, and that's awesome.
Yeah.
And I think that what you're touching on is something that we run into again and again when we're discussing the sacred, that it's really difficult, impossible, maybe not. It's hard to prove a negative, but it's really difficult to find the point where you've said everything that there has to say, or that you know everything there is to know about it.
Yep. That's that depth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's a lot of other things you could probably say that about. Almost any meaningful aesthetic type experience, any meaningful art is going to be, you don't exhaust it easily, right?
Right.
I mean, there may be, I don't know, like some of this minimalist sort of stuff, say Hans Olbers' squares or something. I don't know. Maybe you exhaust them somehow. Maybe I just don't understand how to talk about them, although
Right.
I kind of like them. But certainly other kinds of art, you can just keep right on going.
Yeah.
You never stop. I go to the Minneapolis Institute of Art every once in a while and, just go and look at that Doryphorus statue, right? There's a lot going on there, even though they keep moving it around and putting it in more out of the way places, or at least they did. But yeah, I mean, there's always a lot, and maybe it's even infinite. I know that was sort of the Kantian idea of the aesthetic ideal or whatever, that it was like a concept, but it was not quite a concept, and it was inexhaustible. You could always talk more about it or learn from it.
Maybe this is a good place to bring up ideas about the inherent connectedness between the aesthetic and the religious, or the aesthetic and the holy.
Right.
And why is it that art is important to religion? I think because they're, I don't know, consubstantial. I don't know if that's maybe too strong a term, or maybe it's not.
Well, so what do both of them do? Both of them bring. So when we're talking religion, I'm speaking specifically about our practices with regard to things that transcend, right? So religion brings those transcendent things into contact with our lives, right?
Yes.
Art brings things that transcend the actual object into contact with our lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
And often those things are religious things, but not always. Certainly there's a lot of religious art. We were just talking about some of it very minimalist, some of it not. That Frey statue, well, we assume Frey. I mean, that phallic god statue from a long time ago, right?
True.
Yeah.
Yes.
Could be some other phallic god, but probably Freyr or Ing or something, who I suspect are the same, as I think most people do, but who knows, right? Yeah, let's be careful. I think that there are accounts of the origins of art that make out art to have begun as a specifically religious thing and then expanded out from there.
I was actually going to ask the same sort of question. Like, would it be possible to conceive of art as a religious technique that's found other sorts of things to express?
I think it's possible to think of it that way. I don't know that that's the truth of it, right? We find these very early objects, carved fish, carved women's bodies, etc. We assume that they're religious. And I think that's likely, but, I wasn't there 100,000 years ago. I don't know. Those caves from like 30,000 years ago with the animals painted in them. I suspect is it religion? Is it, hunting magic or something? Are they different? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
There's certainly something going on there. So I'm not sure that I feel comfortable saying, yes, art started as religious and then became, and then expanded outward into non-religious areas. But certainly, I think it has always had a connection to religion. And religion has often been its preliminary place, or its primary place. I'm not sure preliminary is the word I want. A primary place, the place where it is allowed to be put to the greatest use, where the best artists are the ones who you hire to make your statues of gods or something.
Sure.
And, the less great artists are the ones who you hire to make a painting of you to put by your door along with your name so that people know that you're you. Right.
Right.
And it feels like the concept of art itself is kind of inexhaustible, but I mean, and so to try to describe it, words are going to kind of fail you a little bit, but it feels like they're born from the same impulse and they kind of aim at the same goal, which is
I think
create and share meaning.
I think that's right. And art is notoriously difficult to define, right? So I'm not even going to try because I'm just not in the mood for notoriously difficult things right now.
Come on, Garrett. We're counting on you to finally put a rest to centuries, if not millennia, of debate on these topics.
All these idiotic thinkers, writing crap. I know the answers. I'm just not telling you.
Yeah, and to tie it back to kind of where we began, I mean, Descartes' linear grid model is trying to reduce existence to kind of this explainable sentence that you can easily wrap your mind around, which is it fails in real life.
Now, whether that's, again, I think that we're working with a caricature of Descartes and a caricature of what followed Descartes. I think that Descartes maintained a lot of room for mysterious things and whatever. But certainly it is an urge that we've had to create structures that we can pin on reality, and then there's reality in our structure. But reality always escapes that structure a little bit. The finer the structure gets, the more we find out that reality is pretty fine itself, right? There's always something that gets away. And that seems to be just part of the nature of reality. There's always something there that's going to be hidden from us, always something there that's going to be mysterious to us. Very little in existence is completely transparent, and mostly what is are things we've made up that don't have much reality to them to begin with, I think.
Thank you for listening to the North Star Podcast. For more information about us, visit axenthof.com. That's AXENTHOF.com. In our next episode, to be published on March 19th, we'll discuss our two-part series on Mircea Eliade's book, The Sacred and the Profane.